Welcome back to McKiLL TV. Today, we look back at yet another horror game, as we take a look back at the original Evil Within. This is a game I've been wanting to cover on this channel for some time now, as I find this particular game to be one of the more interesting titles in the survival horror genre. So in today's video, we will be looking at everything this game has to offer, as well as its flaws. So, just be warned that in this video, there will be story spoilers as we discuss most aspects of this game. The Evil Within is a survival horror game developed by Tango Gameworks and published by Bethesda Software. The game was directed by Resident Evil series creator Shinji Mikami and was released worldwide in October of 2014 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PS4, Xbox One, and PC. The Evil Within story centers on protagonist Sebastian Castellanos, as he is pulled through a distorted world full of nightmarish locations and horrid creatures. The game is played in a third-person perspective. Players battle disfigured nightmarish-like enemies, including bosses as well, all the while using guns and melee weapons, and progress through the levels, avoiding traps and using stealth, as well as the ability to find collectibles. The game begins as Detective Sebastian Castellanos and his partners Joseph and Junior Detective Julie Kidman arrive at Beacon Mental Hospital on the call of a multiple homicide taking place on the hospital grounds, with little to no other information regarding this incident. As Sebastian and the others arrive on location, they are greeted to a massacre as they enter the hospital. The game's opening sequence is rather slow and cinematic, forcing the player to slowly walk in certain areas in order to truly focus on the environment and setting of the early areas of the game.
Did you hear something?
Shortly after entering the hospital, Sebastian and Joseph discover a survivor.
Are you injured? What happened here?
Can't be real. Impossible.
After this, Sebastian checks the surveillance footage. He sees a hooded, pale, ghostly-like figure maneuvering through the hospital corridors, killing guards and officers, just before seemingly noticing Sebastian's presence.
What the hell?
Sebastian soon finds himself separated from the others. As he awakens in a dark, wet room, he is bound and hanging upside down from the ceiling. As he gains consciousness, he notices that there are others hanging from the ceiling as well. And he soon sees a large, monstrous man butchering one of the others. As Sebastian looks around, he sees a chance to escape when he discovers a knife lodged into one of the nearby bodies. Sebastian is able to swing himself over to the knife so that he's able to cut himself free. This is where the game really begins, and one of my favorite parts of the game. Sebastian must find a way to escape this area. As he looks around, he discovers a set of ordinary-looking keys. In this section, Sebastian must use stealth in order to maneuver this area to get around this monstrous man. In doing so, Sebastian is able to find the keys and unlock a nearby door. Thinking he may have found his way out, In doing so, Sebastian catches a tripwire that alerts the monstrous man, beginning a chase sequence. The opening portion of this game centers around a few chase sequences, as well as some hide-and-seek stealth-style gameplay, which ranges around 12 to 14-15 minutes. Some people don't particularly care for this opening segment, as the rest of the gameplay throughout is mostly your typical third-person survival horror style combat with stealth elements mixed into the core gameplay. Although, for myself, I would say I particularly enjoyed this opening segment, as I found it to be thrilling, but yet slow and dreadful, as you maneuver around the chainsaw-wielding madman. This portion of the game doesn't allow for Sebastian to engage in any form of combat with the hulking chainsaw monster man. Instead, like I mentioned, the player will have to rely on stealth in order to navigate these areas and escape. Once again, this is just an opening segment of the game. It really doesn't necessarily reflect the overall core gameplay, but it does introduce the stealth elements, which are needed as the game progresses. In these areas, Sebastian simply just needs to navigate from point A to point B without being spotted. And successfully doing this will prompt the final chase sequence of this segment, where Sebastian is chased down a corridor of wheelchairs and gurneys in order to narrowly reach a very conveniently placed elevator. I found this final portion to be very tense, with Sebastian falling all over the place. It feels you're about to be demolished by the chainsaw at any second. As far as the overall gameplay is concerned, the game primarily focuses on three key gameplay elements. These three key elements being survival horror, alternating environments, and traps and puzzles. As for the survival horror element of the game, just like many other survival horror games, the player must navigate through hostile game world with limited resources. This requires the player to use their wits to survive and correctly manage their few resources that they encounter through various terrors and dangers throughout the game, very similar to Resident Evil. Even though the inventory management isn't quite as, let's say, in-depth, you still have to manage it. Limited item pickups throughout the game is something that you have to manage, just like in any other survival horror game. Another element, traps and puzzles. The player not only needs to struggle to survive, but also faces dangerous traps and mechanisms throughout this playthrough. Being careless with traps can cause death. However, the player can also utilize traps to their own advantage, as well as carefully disarming traps and mechanisms. As for the alternating environments key of the game, throughout this game, the environments may change without warning in real life time based on the player's action, adding more variables to the game and more things to pay attention to. While exploring, the camera is set behind the player in a third-person style camera view and is able to freely move around them. However, the camera can also change views sometimes. During combat, aiming puts the camera in the over-the-shoulder mode. Combat isn't usually forced upon the player, as supplies are scarce in the game, like we mentioned before. The player can run away and hide, which is something you will have to do throughout the game at particular moments. Avoid the enemies by using stealth and sneaking or performing stealth kills. The player also has access to a last resort weapon called the Agony Crossbow, capable of utilizing various bolts. The Agony Crossbow is actually one of the more important weapons in the game. It comes in handy in many moments, especially in the boss fights and when you're fighting a horde. Using the crossbow's various bolts, the player can shoot them either at the enemies or onto surfaces to set up a trap for the enemies to walk into. Very useful. And as you can see in that previous clip, the player will have access to a safe house called Safe Haven that can be accessed during scripted events or by finding bright glowing mirrors. The safe house is actually a mental hospital, and has several accessible areas. While accessing the safe haven, Sebastian can save the game as well as upgrade his skills. In Safe Haven, there is a room full of safes where you can find keys throughout the game to open storage units that will contain useful items, such as ammunition, green gel, and other things used to upgrade or aid your survival. These storage unit keys can be found and collected by finding and breaking Madonna statues hidden throughout the game's levels. There is a nurse called Tatiana who greets Sebastian when he teleports in and out of the safe room. The game is broken up into chapters or levels, and there's 15 of those, which players can complete in order to progress through the story. The game is played, like I mentioned before, from a third-person perspective, in which scavenging for supplies and learning when to fight and when to run are the key factors to surviving this dangerous world. The dangers that Sebastian will have to watch for throughout his journey include bear traps, barbed wire traps, bombs, spike traps, and the Haunted, which are the game's most common enemy. As I mentioned previously, the game does have boss fights. We will get more into who these bosses are as I talk more into this video, but I will briefly talk about who they are. Reborn Laura is a multi-limbed, long-haired crawling creature, who Sebastian will run into numerous times throughout the game's story. Ruvik is the game's main antagonist, who we've seen already in the gameplay that I've shown. Another boss that reoccurs a couple times throughout this story is the Keeper, who is a large man with a safe as a head. And the monstrous chainsaw-wielding man that we talked about earlier is actually referred to as the Sadist. He's a large humanoid man wearing spiked metal mask on his face and wields a chainsaw. Throughout the game, the player will need to make use of the environment and things they may find in order to survive. The game world can transform, as I mentioned before, during scripted events and as a result of the player's actions. This can lead to altering locations and creating new paths, or teleporting the player to a new area. Sebastian can find and use syringes and medical kits to heal himself when he's injured. The medical kit expands Sebastian's health, but causes hallucinations to occur for a short time. Collecting vials of green gel hidden throughout the game, or when the player kills enemies, the player can upgrade Sebastian when he's at Safe Haven. More ammunition, extra stamina, and additional health are some of the upgrades that Sebastian can give himself by collecting the green gel. When using the game's combat, you will realize that the player will have access to various weapons such as revolver, shotgun, sniper rifle, knives, grenade, and of course the Agony crossbow. I personally find that the Agony crossbow is the most useful weapon. It fires projectiles and fires bolts capable of freezing, blinding, electrifying, and exploding enemies. Ammunition for weapons is very scarce, as it is in pretty much any survival horror game. But mechanical components can be harvested to craft additional bolts for the Agony crossbow.
What is going on here?
One source of components: bombs or traps that react to the player's proximity or movement. Bombs can be stuck on walls or on the floor, in chests or in vending machines. The bombs can be disarmed via a mini game. Melee combat is designed only to create distance between the player and enemies, although the player can instantly kill some unaware enemies by sneaking up on them and using stealth. Enemies that are downed or incapacitated are capable of revival, but to avoid this, the player can set them on fire, using a limited supply of matches to permanently defeat them. Certain items in the environment, such as bottles, can be thrown to stun or distract enemies. Speaking of the enemies in this game, I want to briefly talk about all the different types of enemies and bosses that you'll encounter when you're playing The Evil Within. The most common enemy throughout the game are known as the Haunted. They are a hapless set of victims who lost themselves to the destructive and uncontrollable nature of the STEM system, twisting and deforming their appearances into hideous, zombie-like beings. You'll find these enemies carrying an array of objects, like barbed wire, glass, rope, and nails. They can wield an incredible variety of weapons, and at times can demonstrate impressive combat maneuvers. Though they endure a tremendous amount of damage in battle, they have a particular weakness to fire. Another set of enemies that the player will encounter throughout the game are known as the alter ego. In contrast to the haunted, alter ego are victims of STEM, who have dissociative identity disorder, and as such, both the consciousness manifested themselves within the system, becoming shambling husks of their former selves. Pink corpse-like creatures, pulsating muscles pulsing through their stomachs, and two heads fighting over the same body. The hostile personality taking over the host's personality, living off of it like a parasite, spewing acid from its tumor-like, razor-sharp teeth. Always snapping, moaning, in agony. If they come near Sebastian, they will slash at him with their bone-like claws, or try to grab him and take substantial amount of health by biting into him. They will also vomit acid, and at times release an insectoid-like creature from its stomach, at the end of a long tentacle, crushing Sebastian's head if it manages to latch on. These foul creatures are brought down quickly by destroying the parasite head. Newborn versions of these creatures, known as the babies, can be seen crawling and hopping around in a few places of the game, and can easily be killed by stomping or kicking them. Another form of enemy encountered in the game are known as trauma, tall, naked humanoids with pale skin and flesh where their face would normally be. They are manifestations of Ruvik's immense hatred for the religion that he was brought up in as a child. They have no forearms, but rather a massive hook-clawed gauntlet attached to their right arm, while their left arm chained to the beam on its back, which will arguably tear off if it's damaged enough. Now moving on to one of the reoccurring bosses throughout the game, known as the Keeper. The Keeper is a dangerous being within STEM that has a safe wrapped in barbed wire as a head. He's very similar to like Pyramid Head from Silent Hill. The Keeper is a manifestation of the safe where Ruvik kept his research. He wields a large meat tenderizer, which is also wrapped in barbed wire, as well as a spiked sack filled with brains of his victims. When killed, he will reanimate through the nearby safe that are scattered around. His appearance is similar to that of a butcher, as he wears a plastic apron and protective gloves. Another reoccurring boss that the player will have to encounter throughout the game is known as Laura, a horrific reincarnation of Ruvik's sister, who perished in a barn fire to save her brother's life. Ruvik longed to be with her so much that his memory of her manifests itself within STEM, twisted by his rage. She has long black hair and 4 strong arms with long sharp claws. Though she wears no clothes, she still has shoes on her feet. Similar to the haunted Ruvik himself, it is revealed that she too has particular weakness to fire. Another enemy that will be encountered throughout the game is the Sentinel, a massive guard dog seen outside of the Cedar Hill Church, which Sebastian must battle to escape with Joseph to find Leslie in the church. The Sentinel is nearly 7 foot tall, with patches of fur missing and barbed wire wrapped around the entirety of its body, as well as railroad spikes impaled into various areas of it. Another enemy known as Zine, one of the twin giants found chained up within the courtyard before the church. He was left on the doorstep of the church and soon grew nearly 10 feet tall. The right side of his face seems to have a bothersome deformity, resembling a healing burn wound. He wields a stone club, which he will swing about wildly, sometimes even throwing it. Neon is the other giant. He is the twin brother of Zen. He was so unstable that a mask was placed over his head, making it so he couldn't see or hear anything. He has a train protruding outwards from his heart as well. In contrast to his brother, Neon will fight using his arms and legs, and his signature finishing move is to tear Sebastian's arm off and step on his face. Another enemy throughout the game are known as Heresy, a massive
spider-like creature born as a result of a person who lost their identity to STEM and went on a rampage, devouring anyone he found. He now has numerous tubes connecting his face to his anus. He is a predominant entity found roaming throughout Crimson City, chasing Sebastian and his partners through the city, eventually latching onto their bus and battling them. And finally, next up is Ruvik himself, the main antagonist of the game. Ruvik is the man who developed STEM almost entirely by himself, and with his brain at the center of STEM, he has completed control over everything within it, turning it into a terrible nightmare world that reflects his own psychotic mind. Ruvik possesses all manners of abilities within the world he has created, though most frequently used by him are teleporting himself and others and summoning monsters. Ruvik frequently appears as a menacing young man wearing a hooded cloak and pants, the rest of his body ravaged by burn scars that consistently cause him pain. The right half of his head is covered with a glass plate, exposing his brain. His primary goal throughout the game is to escape STEM and once again wreak havoc in the world. Amalgam is a creature that serves as the final boss in the game, and is a combination of Ruvik and Amalgam Alpha, among other things, forming a beast nearly 100 feet tall, with various deformed limbs. This is the final fight in the game. Now I kind of want to summarize the plot and what is actually taking place in this game. So if you're not familiar with the game's story, just know that spoilers are coming up. Through the game, Sebastian wanders through dark forests and many abandoned buildings, full of monstrous creatures. You'll notice throughout the playthrough that Sebastian will come in contact with Ruvik several different times. Later in the game, Sebastian runs into a character named Oscar, who is suffering from a strange form of transformation which compels him into a murderous rage. Sebastian is then forced to kill Oscar in self-defense. Sebastian soon encounters one of Beacon's doctors, Marcello, who is searching for his patient, Leslie. Sebastian eventually reunites with his partner Joseph, though it is shortly revealed that Joseph is suffering from a strange form of transformation, which compels him into a murderous rage, similar to what Oscar was dealing with. While he was able to control it for the most part, Joseph warns Sebastian to be wary of him if he turns. The two eventually find and rescue Kidman from drowning in a crude contraption, though they are soon separated again. Sebastian learns the story of Ruvik, who was born Ruben Victoriano, through various memories that Ruvik places in him. Ruben was intellectually gifted, but mentally unstable child, and was close to his sister Laura. While playing in the barn on their family's estate, Laura was killed and Ruben was severely burned after the barn was set on fire by some farmers as an act of revenge against his parents. Due to his disfigurement from the fire, Ruben's father hid him in the basement of the family manor. Deeply traumatized over Laura's death, Ruben eventually killed both of his parents, took control of their fortune, and continued to donate money to a Beacon mental hospital in exchange for test subjects for his experiments into the human psyche. Ruvik began designing STEM as a means for him to reshape reality, so that he could physically travel back into his memories and live his life again with Laura. Dr. Marcello then took notice of Ruvik's work and revealed it to Morbius, who wished to use it in their own purposes. As a safety measure, Ruvik calibrated STEM to work with only his brain as the core. In retaliation, Morbius simply killed him and extracted his brain for installation in order to use the machine, thus allowing Ruvik to maintain control of STEM's world. Kidman realizes that Morbius in fact wants to meet Leslie as the replacement for Ruvik's brain, and easily manipulated blank slate mind, which they can use to power STEM and create a world of their own design. When Dr. Marcello, aided by Sebastian, tries to use Leslie to return to reality, he realizes that Ruvik wants to transfer his mind to a compatible host and escape into the real world. A beast created from Ruvik's subconscious kills Dr. Marcello, and Ruvik scatters the group across his mind. Kidman finds Leslie first, and is about to shoot him to prevent Ruvik from using him as a host, when Sebastian and Joseph intervene, prompting her to shoot Joseph, before Ruvik separates them once again. Later in the game, Sebastian finds Leslie and guides him back to the hospital. At the top of the lighthouse, he sees his own body in a bathtub hooked up to the stim machine. Then Kidman arrives and attempts to convince Sebastian that Leslie has to die. Ruvik interrupts them, gets a hold of Leslie, and absorbs him. In the finale of the game, Sebastian battles a gigantic creature created from Ruvik's subconscious. Waking up in the bathtub after defeating it, he pulls himself off the machine and removes Ruvik's brain from the stem and crushes it. At the end of the game, he wakes up in the tub again, with Kidman by his side. Kidman motions for Sebastian to stay quiet. Sebastian falls unconscious and later wakes up in the same tub, with no one around except for the bodies of Conley and Dr. Marcello. As police and SWAT reinforcements arrive, Sebastian exits the hospital and notices Leslie walking out of the main gates. This is the very end of the game. The game comes to an end as it interprets that Ruvik has taken Leslie as his host in order to live in reality once and for all. This is the basic summary of the game's main story, which is fairly interesting, but does have some loopholes overall that the game doesn't really explain until the DLC content. Overall, I believe the game's director Shinji Mikami wanted to get back to the roots of survival horror genre, as around the same time Resident Evil was going in a more action-oriented direction, believing that the survival horror tropes had become predictable over time. The game was deliberately designed to make the player feel powerless by taking place in confined areas, limiting ammunition and pickups, and presenting nearly invisible enemies that promote the player to run and hide rather than engaging with every enemy. With The Evil Within, I think Shinji Mikami had his vision for the game, but perhaps fell a little bit short with the final product. The game's story overall is just okay. It's not overly interesting, and the gameplay alone is slow and clunky and overall just frustrating. The Evil Within is strongly influenced by other survival horror titles, the most obvious being Resident Evil, particularly Resident Evil 4, with the story seemingly being influenced by the likes of a Silent Hill style that tries to focus more on psychological horror than anything else. In as much as Mikami wanted to get back to the roots of survival horror, I feel like The Evil Within becomes very action-oriented about halfway through the story, and kills the overall immersion and horror that the game was building up to that point. To be honest, I personally really enjoyed the first 5 chapters of the game the most, and feels like it begins to unravel from that point on, as the game's overall runtime feels entirely too long, as the chapters and story seem to drag the player along from that point on.
Sebastian, listen to me.
The game would go on to receive mostly positive reviews, with most critics pointing out holes in the game's story, as well as a number of technical issues as well. The Evil Within does succeed in scratching that itch for the ways of the old survival horror games, but doesn't exactly hit the mark all the way around.
That's why
The Evil Within was successful enough to spawn a sequel, The Evil Within 2, as the series was handed over to a new director. The sequel would take place 3 years after the events of the first game,
allowed to live.
and would feature more fleshed out story, as well as overall superior gameplay to the first game. My final thoughts on The Evil Within are that the gameplay can be the most frustrating part of experiencing this series, as it purposely tries to feel slow and clunky with its combat, to make the player feel almost powerless at times, while also managing your item inventory, like a survival horror game from the past. But what it really does is just frustrates the player, more than building any dread or suspense. However, if you are a horror gamer, then I would most definitely recommend this series, as over time it does have a spot amongst the genre heavyweights, regardless of its flaws. I like a lot of what the game tries to do, regardless of difficulty or its runtime. It still manages to deliver a genuine horror experience at its core, and is a series I will revisit over time. Anyways, thanks for watching this retrospective on The Evil Within. If you like this video, please be sure to hit that thumbs up below. And if you're interested in more horror games like this, then be sure to subscribe to McKiLL TV, as I cover more horror, retro, and controversial games across all platforms.
But until next time, this is McKiLL TV signing off, and I'll catch you in a future video.
I created this world. You cannot keep me here.